The Legacy of the Chola Seas. Chapter 1, The Tides of Destiny. The salt-laden breeze swept through the grand harbour of Nagapattinam, carrying with it the murmurs of merchants, the clang of shipbuilders' hammers, and the rhythmic chants of sailors preparing for the next great voyage. The Chola Empire's might was not just in its towering temples and bustling cities but in its mastery of the seas. And at the heart of it all stood Princess Ilavarasi Meenakshi, watching the horizon from the balcony of the Admiral's palace. Her silk sari, woven in deep blues and gold, billowed in the wind, mimicking the restless waves below. Unlike other princesses who spent their days immersed in courtly life, Meenakshi longed for the adventures of the ocean. She had grown up listening to her father's tales of victorious naval battles, of distant lands beyond the Malayan archipelago, of riches carried by the tides. But as a woman, she was destined for a different path, one of alliances through marriage, of duty to the empire, of watching the world from gilded cages. But Meenakshi had never been one to accept her fate without a fight. Ilavarasi, a voice called. She turned to see Rajaguru Vishnukanthan, the wise old priest who had served her family for decades. His piercing gaze held both fondness and warning. "You watch the sea as if it calls to you," he remarked. Meenakshi smiled. "Perhaps it does, Rajaguru. If the gods gifted me the heart of a sailor, why must I remain ashore? The sea is not kind to those who defy its laws. You are a princess, not a warrior. Your destiny is written in the stars." Meenakshi knew the priest spoke of the impending decision. Her father, Admiral Karunakaran, had been summoned to the royal court, where the emperor would decide her marriage. It was the way of the empire, daughters of noble blood were pieces in the grand game of diplomacy. But she was not ready to be traded away like a silk-laden merchant vessel. That night, as the moon cast silver streaks over the restless waters, a new fleet returned to the harbour. Among the warriors disembarking from the flagship was Captain Arjun Varman, his armour glinting under the torchlight, his eyes scanning the shore with the discipline of a seasoned commander. He had returned victorious from the latest expedition to Srivijaya, securing another foothold in the empire's maritime dominance. Arjun was no noble by birth. The son of a fisherman, he had risen through the ranks through sheer will and skill. The Chola navy had become his life, his devotion, and now, whispers in the court suggested that he would soon be granted a higher honour, perhaps even the title of Senapati, the supreme naval commander. As he stepped onto the docks, his gaze landed on Meenakshi, who had descended from her balcony to witness the fleet's return. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. She had heard of him before, the daring young captain whose victories had sent fear into the hearts of the empire's enemies. He, in turn, knew her name, though she was but a distant figure in the palace halls. Neither spoke. But the sea, ever restless, carried something unspoken between them. Meenakshi turned and disappeared into the palace, her heart pounding against her ribs. Arjun watched her go, unaware that their fates were already being woven together by the hands of destiny. And soon, the sea would bear witness to a love and adventure unlike any before. Here's the next chapter of the legacy of the Chola Seas. Chapter 2, A Voyage into the Unknown. The dawn broke over Nagapattinam's harbour, painting the waters in gold and crimson. The great Chola fleet, with its towering masts and gilded prows, swayed in the morning tide, readying itself for departure. Hundreds of sailors bustled across the decks, loading provisions and fastening ropes, their voices blending into the symphony of an empire built on the sea. Meenakshi stood at the edge of the docks, her heart pounding in her chest. Today, the fleet would sail for the Malayan archipelago, and with it, Captain Arjun Varman, whose name had lingered in her thoughts since the moment their eyes met. But she had no time for idle fantasies. Disguised in a simple sailor's tunic, her long hair braided and tucked beneath a cloth, Meenakshi slipped through the crowd. She had spent years listening to the stories of the sea, but this time, she would live them. She would set sail. The stowaway princess. Meenakshi moved swiftly, her heart hammering against her ribs as she climbed up the side of the Valimitra, the flagship of the fleet. The moment her feet touched the deck, she pressed herself into the shadows, watching as the crew rushed past. Her father believed her to be safely confined within the palace, preparing for a future she did not want. He would never imagine she was here, aboard one of the mightiest ships of the Chola Empire. The fleet set sail, the great vessels unfurling their sails like the wings of celestial swans. The sea stretched endless before them, the wind filling the sails, propelling them toward the unknown. For hours, Meenakshi hid within the lower decks, her breath shallow as she listened to the rhythmic creak of the ship. It wasn't until hunger gnawed at her that she dared venture out. She crept along the wooden passages, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of the sailors. But just as she reached for a bundle of stored rice, a voice rang out behind her. "You don't belong here." Meenakshi whirled around, her pulse racing. Arjun Varman stood in the dim lantern light, arms crossed over his broad chest. His piercing gaze was unreadable, though a flicker of surprise danced in his eyes. She straightened, forcing steel into her voice. "Neither do you." His brow arched. "I am the captain of this ship." Meenakshi swallowed. Of all the people to discover her, it had to be him. The captain's dilemma. Arjun studied the girl before him, the same one he had seen watching from the harbour the night before. He had heard the stories of Princess Meenakshi, the admiral's willful daughter, but he never imagined she would go to such lengths. "You do not understand what you have done," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is not a place for a princess." "I am not a princess here," she retorted. "I am just another sailor." Arjun exhaled sharply. She was bold, reckless, but something in her eyes reminded him of himself as a young recruit, desperate to prove himself in a world that refused to bend. "Do you have any idea what would happen if your father discovered this?" he asked. Meenakshi lifted her chin. "I imagine you would be thrown in chains for allowing it." Arjun smirked despite himself. "Then why risk my life, Illavarasi?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Because I would rather be a prisoner of the sea than a prisoner of the palace." Arjun let out a slow breath. He could send her back, order a smaller vessel to return her to the shores of Nagapattinam before they ventured too far. But something told him she would not go quietly. The fleet had already sailed past the point of return. To turn back would be an insult to the emperor himself. "Fine," he muttered. "But if you stay, you obey my command." Meenakshi's lips curled into a triumphant smile. "Then I suppose you should teach me how to be a sailor." Arjun sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was going to be a long voyage. Distant storms. As the sun set on the horizon, the fleet pressed forward into the vast expanse of the ocean. Neither Meenakshi nor Arjun knew that forces beyond their control were already conspiring against them. A shadow moved in the waters beyond their sight, a smaller vessel, its black sails blending with the coming night. A Srivahayan prince, sworn enemy of the Cholas, watched from afar. His lips curled into a wicked grin. "The Empire's fleet sails blind," he murmured to his men. "Prepare the ambush. Here's the next chapter of the legacy of the Chola Seas." Chapter 3, Secrets Beneath the Moonlit Waves. The Valamitra sliced through the inky black waters, the rhythmic creaking of its wooden hull mingling with the distant calls of seabirds. The fleet sailed smoothly under the silver glow of the full moon, its course set toward the rich and mysterious lands of the Malayan archipelago. On deck, Meenakshi tightened the ropes of the mast under Arjun's watchful gaze, her fingers raw from the unfamiliar labor. The past few days had been a relentless test of endurance, rowing alongside the oarsmen, scrubbing the decks, hoisting sails, and learning the language of the sea. But she never complained. If the crew suspected she was not one of them, none dared question Arjun's decision to keep her aboard. They assumed she was a young recruit, perhaps a noble-born boy seeking adventure, a deception Meenakshi had no interest in correcting. But Arjun knew the truth. And it vexed him more than he cared to admit. She was quick, determined, and far too reckless for her own good. She had no place aboard a warship, yet here she was, staring defiantly at the endless horizon, refusing to be anything less than free. And worse, she was proving to be an excellent sailor. A night of confessions. You should rest, Arjun said, approaching her near the bow. You'll be of no use to me if you collapse. Meenakshi smirked, rubbing her sore hands. Are you concerned for my well-being, Captain? Arjun exhaled through his nose. I am concerned for the state of my ship. If you slip and fall overboard, I'll have to waste time fishing you out. She chuckled, leaning against the wooden railing. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, shimmering like molten silver beneath the moonlight. For a moment, the world felt impossibly vast, as if they were the only two souls upon it. You've spent your whole life at sea, she murmured. Haven't you ever wanted to know what lies beyond the horizon? Arjun studied her, the moon casting sharp angles across his face. I don't need to wonder. I've seen it. The golden temples of Srivijaya, the lush forests of Khmer, the distant islands where men speak in tongues we do not know. The world is wider than you can imagine. She turned to him, her eyes filled with longing. And yet, I have never seen any of it. He should not have pitied her. She was a princess, bound to the comforts of her father's palace. But in that moment, she looked less like royalty and more like a caged bird staring at an open sky. You were never meant to, he said, softer than he intended. Meenakshi exhaled, tilting her head toward the sky. Then why do I feel like I was born for the sea? Arjun didn't have an answer. Shadows on the water. The peace of the night did not last. A sudden flicker on the horizon, a shadow moving where none should be. Arjun's gaze snapped toward the dark expanse, his instincts coiling tight. He strode toward the ship's edge, scanning the waters. Their black sails. Pirates. Or worse, Srivijayan marauders. The enemy ship ghosted across the waves, its lights dimmed, its approach silent. It was tracking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Arjun clenched his jaw. Wake the men. Meenakshi followed his gaze, her fingers tightening around the wooden rail. What is it? Trouble, he muttered. Within moments, the crew stirred. Swords were drawn, arrows notched, torches lit. The Valamitra was no merchant vessel, it was a warship, built for battle. Arjun turned to Meenakshi, his voice low and firm. You stay out of this. She bristled. I can fight. You will follow my orders, he snapped, eyes flashing. This is no palace duel. If they board this ship, they will slaughter everyone in their path. For the first time since setting sail, Meenakshi saw something rare in Arjun's gaze: fear. Not for himself. For her. The realization sent a shiver through her spine. The enemy ship inched closer. The ambush had begun. And by dawn, blood would stain the Chola Seas. Chapter 4, Storms of War and Heart. The first arrow sliced through the night air, embedding itself into the wooden mast with a dull thud. Arjun didn't hesitate. To arms, he bellowed, drawing his sword. The crew erupted into action, grabbing weapons, raising shields, and taking defensive positions along the Valamitra's deck. Meenakshi's heart pounded, but she refused to shrink into the shadows. She grabbed a fallen dagger from the deck and pressed herself against the railing, eyes fixed on the enemy ship. The Srivijayan marauders were closing in fast. Their black-sailed vessel cut through the waves like a spectre of doom, its warriors bare-chested, tattooed, and armed to the teeth, ready to spill Chola blood. Then, with a great crash, the ships collided. Blades and blood. The battle erupted in a blur of flashing steel and clashing shields. The marauders swung grappling hooks onto the Valamitra, pulling themselves aboard like demons rising from the sea. Arjun moved like a storm, cutting down the first intruder with a brutal strike, his sword a blur of silver under the moonlight. Hold the line, he roared, deflecting a blow and driving his blade into another attacker's chest. Meenakshi gripped her dagger tightly. A Srivijayan warrior lunged at her, but she ducked beneath his swing, slicing his arm before darting away. Her breath came in ragged gasps. This was no practice bout in the palace gardens. This was survival. She barely had time to react before another attacker lunged. Faster! Smarter! She sidestepped, using the movement of the rocking ship to unbalance him. With a desperate shove, she sent him tumbling overboard. Arjun saw her from across the deck, his jaw tightening. Damn her stubbornness! She was holding her own, but she was no soldier. And in battle, one mistake was all it took to die. He cut his way toward her, carving through the enemy ranks. But before he could reach her, a sharp cry tore through the night. Meenakshi spun just in time to see Rajiv, a young Chola sailor, struck down by a Srivahayan blade. The enemy warrior raised his sword for the killing blow. Meenakshi didn't think. She acted. With a fierce cry, she lunged forward, ramming her dagger into the attacker's side. The warrior gasped, staggering before collapsing onto the deck. Rajiv stared at her in shock. Ilavarasi. But there was no time for questions. The battle raged on. The turning tide. Despite the ambush, the Cholas fought back fiercely. Arjun led his men with relentless precision, cutting down the remaining marauders one by one. Soon, the tide turned. The surviving Srivahayans, realizing they were outmatched, retreated, their vessel slipping into the darkness. Silence fell over the Valimitra. The deck was littered with bodies, the scent of blood thick in the salty air. Meenakshi panted, her hands trembling, the dagger still clutched tightly in her grip. She had killed a man. She had saved a life. Before she could fully process it, Arjun was in front of her, his eyes blazing with something between anger and relief. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. Meenakshi lifted her chin. "I was fighting." Arjun grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. "You could have died." "So could you," she shot back. Their gazes locked, the tension between them crackling like lightning over the sea. For a moment, the world around them faded, the battle, the blood, the war. There was only the wild rush of their hearts and the undeniable truth between them. She had proven herself. And he had seen it. Arjun exhaled sharply, releasing her wrist. "Next time," he said, voice lower, "stay behind me." Meenakshi's lips curled into a small, defiant smile. "No promises." The calm before the storm. The battle had been won, but Arjun knew this was just the beginning. The Srivahayans had attacked with purpose. This wasn't mere piracy, it was a warning. War was coming. As the crew tended to the wounded and the dead were given to the sea, Arjun stood at the edge of the deck, watching the horizon. Meenakshi approached, quieter now, her usual fire dimmed by the weight of what had just happened. "I killed a man tonight," she murmured. Arjun didn't look at her. "It won't be the last." She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Does it ever get easier?" "No," he admitted. "But you learn to live with it." Meenakshi glanced at him. There was something heavy in his voice, as if he carried ghosts she could not see. The night stretched long and silent, the waves lapping gently against the hull. The Chola fleet sailed on, but neither Meenakshi nor Arjun could shake the feeling that fate had just set them on a path neither could turn away from. And somewhere in the distance, a Srivahayan prince, watching from the shadows, smiled. The game had begun. Here's the next chapter of the legacy of the Chola Seas. Chapter 5, Shadows of the Past, Fires of the Future. The Valimitra sailed onward, its deck scarred with the remnants of battle. The crew moved with silent efficiency, tending to the wounded and reinforcing the ship's defenses. The taste of blood and salt still lingered in the air, but the night was calm once more, deceptively so. Meenakshi sat at the edge of the deck, her gaze lost in the vast ocean ahead. The dagger she had wielded in battle lay across her lap, its steel catching the moonlight. Her hands no longer trembled, but inside, a storm raged. She had taken a life. She had always imagined herself as a warrior, fierce, unstoppable, unafraid. But the truth was different. The moment her blade had sunk into flesh, something inside her had changed. Would she ever be the same again? A ghost from the deep. Arjun stood at the helm, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The Srivahayan ship had retreated, but he was no fool. They would be back. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. You fight like a man with nothing to lose, Captain. Arjun turned to see Sayadhana, the fleet's second in command, leaning against the mast, his arms crossed. He was older than Arjun, a seasoned warrior who had served under the Chola banners for decades. Arjun smirked, though there was little humor in it. Perhaps I don't. Sayadhana studied him for a long moment before glancing toward Meenakshi. She fights well for one who has never seen war. Arjun's expression darkened. She shouldn't have been fighting at all. And yet, she saved one of our own. Arjun said nothing. He knew Sayadhana was right. Meenakshi had earned her place among them. But that did not mean he had to like it. She is her father's daughter, Sayadhana continued. You of all people should understand that. Arjun tensed at the words. A shadow passed over his face, memories of another time, another life stirring in his chest. Let the past lie, old man, he muttered before walking away. But the past never stayed buried for long. The whisper of betrayal. As dawn broke, the Chola fleet approached a chain of small islands off the coast of Sumatra. They would stop to resupply before continuing their journey eastward. Meenakshi stood at the bow, watching the emerald green waters lap against the shore. For the first time since she had stepped aboard, she felt a sense of peace. But that peace shattered with Arjun's next words. There is a traitor among us. She spun to face him. What? Arjun's jaw was set. The Srivahayans knew exactly where to strike. They ambushed us in the dead of night, waiting for our weakest moment. Someone sent word ahead. Meenakshi's stomach twisted. Who? I don't know yet, Arjun admitted. But I intend to find out. Her thoughts raced. Who among them would betray the Chola Empire? The crew was loyal, battle-hardened, devoted to their cause. And yet, someone had sent a message. Someone had guided their enemies straight to them. And if they didn't uncover the traitor soon, the next ambush would not be so easily survived. An uneasy alliance. That night, as the fleet anchored by the island's shore, Arjun approached Meenakshi in the dim torchlight. I need your help, he said without preamble. She arched a brow. I thought you wanted me to stay out of danger. Arjun exhaled. I do. But I also know that people speak freely around you because they don't see you as a threat. Meenakshi smirked. And you do. He met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. I see you for what you are. She felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to focus. What do you need me to do? Listen, Arjun said. Watch. If someone is feeding information to our enemies, they will slip up. She nodded. And if I find them? Arjun's expression hardened. Then I will do what must be done. A chill ran down Meenakshi's spine. There was no hesitation in his voice, only cold, ruthless certainty. This was war. And in war, mercy was a luxury. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the tides were shifting once more. The battle had ended. But the real danger was only just beginning. Chapter 6, The Serpent Among Us. The island of Pulau Jingga was a paradise of emerald green waters and thick jungle, its shores kissed by golden sand. The Chola fleet anchored just beyond the shallows, while longboats ferried men and supplies onto the beach. But beneath the island's beauty, danger lurked. Meenakshi could feel it in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the quiet tension among the crew, the knowledge that a traitor walked among them. She was not a spy, nor had she ever played the game of deception. But if Arjun trusted her to find the serpent hiding in their midst, she would not fail. Whispers in the dark. As dusk fell, Meenakshi moved through the camp, listening. The sailors sat around crackling fires, mending their weapons and sharing stories of past battles. Laughter rang out here and there, but underneath it all, there was an uneasiness. She lingered near one group, pretending to adjust the bandages on her hand as she listened. "They knew our course too well," one sailor murmured, eyes darting over his shoulder. "We were lucky to survive that ambush." Another man, a grizzled veteran, nodded grimly. "If there's a traitor, we'll find him. And when we do," he mimed a throat being slit. A third sailor scoffed. "You're all seeing ghosts. The Srivahayans have spies everywhere. It doesn't mean one of us betrayed the fleet." "But what if someone did?" Meenakshi asked, forcing her voice to be casual. "Who would have sent word ahead?" The men exchanged wary glances. Finally, the grizzled veteran spat into the sand. "If you ask me, the ones who never take up arms in battle are the ones we should be watching." Meenakshi stiffened. "Who do you mean?" The man shrugged. "Some of the merchants who accompany the fleet. The ones who deal with the ports, keep the ledgers. We fight and bleed, but they keep their hands clean." Meenakshi frowned. It was true several merchants and scribes travelled with the Chola fleet to conduct trade and negotiations. They were necessary, but easy to overlook. And easy to hide behind. A trail of gold. Her instincts told her she was close. She found Arjun near the edge of the camp, sharpening his sword. He didn't look up when she approached. "Anything?" he asked. She hesitated. "The men suspect the merchants." That caught his attention. He glanced at her, eyes narrowing. "Which one?" "I don't know yet. But someone is profiting from this betrayal. If I can find where the money is going." Arjun nodded. "Then we find our traitor. The trap is set." Meenakshi didn't sleep that night. Instead, she waited in the shadows near the supply tents, watching. Then movement. A cloaked figure slipped between the crates, moving with the careful precision of someone who did not wish to be seen. Meenakshi's pulse quickened. She stayed low, trailing the figure as it made its way toward the jungle's edge. The man knelt near a cluster of palm trees, pulling something from his robes, a scroll, wrapped in waxed leather. He buried it beneath the roots, patting the earth flat. Meenakshi's breath caught. A message. Before she could think, she stepped forward, pressing the tip of her dagger against the traitor's back. "Stand up," she ordered. The man stiffened, then slowly rose to his feet. As he turned, the firelight caught his face. Raghavan. A merchant, known for his quiet demeanor and sharp business sense. He had sailed with the fleet for years, trusted by many. And now, a traitor. "Ilavarasi," he breathed, eyes darting around for an escape. "This is a misunderstanding." Meenakshi scoffed. "Burying messages in the dead of night? A strange misunderstanding. I can explain." She stepped closer. "Then explain why the Srivahayans knew where to find us." Raghavan's expression faltered. A flicker of panic crossed his face. She had him. But before she could react, his hand flashed toward a hidden dagger. Meenakshi dodged just in time, his blade grazing her arm. She stumbled back, pain flaring through her skin. Raghavan turned to run. Only to freeze as Arjun's sword pressed against his throat. The captain had moved with lightning speed, emerging from the shadows like a phantom. His dark eyes were cold as steel. "You made a mistake," Arjun said, voice low. Raghavan trembled. "Captain, please. Who are you working for?" The merchant swallowed. I had no choice. The Srivahayans, they offered gold, protection. They said you would be spared," Arjun finished. "But you knew better." Raghavan's eyes darted between them. He saw no mercy. He would die tonight. Meenakshi turned to Arjun. "What do we do with him?" Arjun didn't hesitate. "We make an example. Justice upon the waves. At dawn, the fleet gathered at the edge of the shore. Raghavan knelt in the sand, bound, his face pale. Arjun stood before the crew, his voice carrying over the waves. "This man betrayed us," he declared. "Because of him, our brothers bled. Because of him, the enemy nearly destroyed us. There is only one punishment for treason." Raghavan's breath came in ragged gasps. "Please," he begged. "Have mercy." Arjun's sword flashed. The traitor's body slumped forward, staining the sand red. The sea lapped at the shore, washing the blood away. Silence fell over the fleet. Meenakshi stared at the body, feeling no triumph, only the cold weight of justice. Arjun turned to her, wiping his blade clean. "War spares no one." She met his gaze, understanding now what he had tried to tell her all along. The sea had changed her. And there was no turning back. Beyond the horizon. As the fleet set sail once more, Meenakshi stood at the bow, staring into the endless blue. The traitor was dead. But something told her the true war had only just begun. And at its heart, she and Arjun would stand side by side, whether by fate or by fire.